Who's your teacher? Talking about ego is complicated. I can't even seem to find a title that really encompasses what this video is going to all be about. Most people see ego and spirit as enemies, but I don't believe that's true. There's something much deeper going on here. When we keep in mind that Source is everything, everywhere, and all the time, well, how can I believe that there's any part of me that isn't also divine? And that's what ego is. It's a part of me. It's part of my psychological makeup. So why am I constantly fighting against it? Is ego really where the problem lies, or is there something else at play? Stick around for a little while and I'll tell you what Spirit showed me about ego's role as our teacher. Have you ever tried to tell the difference between a raven and a crow? I have. They're both large black birds, but they do have a few distinctive traits that make it possible to tell them apart. Unfortunately, I tend to get those traits confused, so I had to find a way to solve my problem, and I decided that it was easiest just to focus on the traits of one of the two birds. That way I would know if it was the bird or if it wasn't that bird. I thought I'd use that same approach today. I initially wanted to discuss how to tell the difference between ego and spirit when they're talking to you, but that initial idea just kept evolving and expanding. And I realized that ego deserves a lot more attention than a simple discussion about how to identify and choose spirit over ego. It's really easy to get the voices of ego and spirit confused. So I am going to address the individual traits, but the individual traits are going to be those of ego for today. Ego is neither good nor bad, though it has been villainized quite a bit. Freud is the one who gave it its current name, but you might be more familiar with it by its Christian term, which was desires of the flesh. Ego is the self-centered part of our personality that focuses on personal desires and identity, and it's constantly working to protect and preserve the human self. Well, that alone is enough for people to despise it, but ego isn't to blame. It has a vital role in our human experience. It provides us with a choice. Without ego, there is no choice. There's no free will if there's nothing to choose between. It's like saying you're free to eat anything in the kitchen, as long as it is the Jiffy Crunchy peanut butter. That isn't free will because you don't actually have a choice, which makes ego our teacher, just like spirit. It's the reason we can decide one path or another and how we want to arrive there. Those who are more vibrationally attuned may recognize and choose spirit as their teacher more often than ego. That's because they can sense the love, abundance, joy, peace, and other things that are present in the higher vibrational frequencies. By contrast, ego exists at our vibrational frequency. Our level of frequency is full of fear, anxiety, worry, suffering, and things like that. We learn from both ego and spirit, but how we learn, that is a question of alignment or attunement to the higher frequencies or to our own level of frequency. With that in mind, let's go ahead and delve into the topic of ego and explore the different ways in which you align yourself to ego, making ego your teacher or instructor. As a teacher in our vibrational reality, ego has characteristics that make it distinguishable from spirit. The first three are the most obvious. Because it exists on our vibrational frequency, when it speaks, it's loud and it's pushy. It demands our immediate attention or response. Ego isn't patient with you or anyone else. Like a petulant child, it wants what it wants when it wants right now. It demands instant gratification. If you wanted to compare ego to a car salesman, you kind of get the idea. You have to buy now or you'll lose this discount or opportunity. And then the more you refuse to listen to ego, the louder and more demanding it gets. If that doesn't work, then it resorts to subterfuge and trickery. I remember in high school, I think it was around 11th grade or so, I was convinced that I needed to prove my faith by bringing a Bible to school with me every day. I didn't want to, but it was a compulsion that I believed came from God. This wasn't a small Bible either. This was one of those real big, thick study Bibles. And I carried it with me from class to class, even if I never or rarely opened it. As if that didn't make me odd enough, I also felt compelled to do an evangelistic message during my speech class. I felt like God was telling me I had to do this, so I did. It was horrible. And this brings up an important point about ego's teaching methods. If you give in to its trickery, lies, and compulsions, ego will reward you with self-consciousness, and not in a good way. My experiences were full of embarrassment and humiliation that I brought it upon myself because I thought the voice I heard came from God. I thought I had to do these things because God was testing me and my faith, and that wasn't a test. I was willing to fail. Ego also tends to be very critical of oneself and others. For the first few decades of my life, I would obsess over every little thing, rehash it repeatedly in my mind, dream about it, and rewrite it a dozen different ways in my head that didn't involve me saying or doing this or that, engaging in some embarrassing or humiliating thing, or being ridiculed. These intrusive, obsessive thoughts would tear me down and reinforce my self-image of being inadequate, unworthy, inferior, and flawed. Those thoughts would just keep looping around my brain until I was so thoroughly exhausted from them that I had nothing left in me. Ego uses this same teaching methodology with guilt and regret. In early adulthood, I went to a Baptist Bible college. If there's one thing Baptists excel at, it's reinforcing ego's teaching methods by constantly preaching about our sinfulness, imperfections, unworthiness, inadequacies, and all the reasons why we deserve to go to hell and why we need a savior. These are all ego-based teaching tools, and I completely bought into it. Those beliefs were so ingrained in me that if I used someone else's pen without permission, I'd be tormented with guilt because I'd feel like I had stolen their ink. That is no way to live. I thought at the time it was the conviction of the Holy Spirit, since that's the sort of thing Baptists teach. But why would God want me to feel inadequate and unworthy? I know now it wasn't God, but ego masquerading as God and righteousness, but it didn't help me then. Many years later, I belonged to a Messianic Jewish congregation, and I had a friend who was just tormented by guilt and regret. He'd tell me about it, and all I could do was nod in agreement because, being a very fervent Messianic at the time, I still believed I had to be perfect. as perfect as a person could be anyway. And we all know perfection is not possible in this body. But that doesn't stop ego from using that impossible standard to remind me of how imperfect I was. Regret, guilt, and self-loathing were my constant companions, and I thought that was how God wanted me to feel about myself. And have you ever noticed how quickly people like to tell you everything that's wrong with you? Everybody has an opinion about how you should dress, act, behave, worship, vote, use your time, or treat others. As you might have already guessed, that's ego talking. Ego encourages you to compare yourself with others, especially with those who are different or less than you in some way. It helps you to feel better about yourself, possibly even superior and arrogant about your position in life, your knowledge, your religion, or your situation. Because, if you're better than others, it's easier to justify destructive practices, destructive thoughts, destructive beliefs. This is how Christians can blithely go around telling everybody they're going to hell because they don't believe this or that, and all the while leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. I have become increasingly conscious of how ego uses fear to teach us. Fear of not being good enough, skilled enough, knowledgeable enough, or enough in any number of other ways. These fears keep us from trying new things, taking risks, being seen or heard, or growing. So what does that leave us with? It leaves us with ego's voice constantly criticizing and belittling us until we're so desperate for validation, we'll take it from anyone. We start looking for saviors outside of ourselves, someone to tell us we're worthwhile, important, loved, accepted just as we are. Some people think they'll find validation in marriage. Others seek it from their peers, some from gangs, others from religion. There are any number of places people can turn, and this is where ego's teaching methods get really painful. More often than not, we're betrayed, abandoned, or otherwise psychologically damaged by the very same people we thought were going to save us. And why is that? It's because most people are doing the exact same thing as us. They're looking to someone else for their validation and salvation. No one is saving anybody else because ego is teaching us an important lesson. Validation, salvation, and acceptance cannot be found outside of oneself. So what happens when people find their so-called tribes, where people of like minds congregate and socialize? Once again, this is a tool ego uses for teaching. It creates an us and them division and separation. Some of these so-called tribes are more benign and harmless than others. These are the ones where it's simply about a shared history, culture, or identity, rather than worth or value. Even the benign so-called tribes provide learning opportunities for ego, but it's the ones focused on worth and value that are the most destructive. Some of these are labeled as terrorist organizations, but many are socially accepted, like religious groups, political factions, those of a similar economic status, and even neighborhoods. And the more people you find that agree with you, the better you feel about yourself. That's why social media is so dangerous. It acts like ego. Computer algorithms recognize what catches your attention, and then it gives you more of the same. This creates echo chambers where people of similar mindsets are artificially brought together. Since the algorithms no longer show you different opinions, beliefs, or thoughts, you start thinking that the whole world agrees with you. Then that makes people in these groups bolder in their beliefs. After all, if everyone agrees that the world is flat, then that must be so. Well, this is also how ego works, whether it's through the social media algorithms, in religions, or in other social cliques. So what happens if there are people in your life that don't agree with you and your newly empowered belief system? Well, that's where ego empowers you to write them off, cancel them, or eviscerate them with labels, descriptions, or other criticisms that show your disdain for them. In so doing, you're elevating yourself up as the arbiter of truth. You're making yourself feel good by putting others down. That is so much an ego trait. When people are emboldened in these echo chambers, ego incites a fear of anything that challenges their shared beliefs, status, or exclusiveness. If you've been wondering why there's been so much activism, well, all this cultural and religious turmoil is about ego teaching us. None of it's about God. Despite the label, theocracies aren't about God. Ego needs to be right, even if it means persecuting, killing, and destroying everyone else, even if it means trying to initiate the apocalypse. Now, if you're from a Christian background, you may notice that ego sounds a lot like the role typically ascribed to Satan, devil, and demons, but there are some very important differences. Ego is part of you. It's not coming from outside yourself. Ego has no interest in destroying you, and it's not at war with God. To the contrary, just like everything else that exists, it's part of the universal consciousness. It does not force itself on you. You have the right to accept or reject its teachings at any time. When you choose ego as your teacher, you are giving permission for ego to use these dense energies that are all around us, this reality that we're dwelling in, to become part of your training, part of your enlightenment. Ego is not a villain. It's not evil. It's not punishing you. It's not controlling you. It exists so you can have free will by giving you a choice other than aligning with the higher vibrational spirit. And as long as you keep choosing ego as your teacher, as long as you keep aligning to ego's energies, your classroom is going to stay in the lower, denser, and often more painful reality that we see around us right now. So why am I making such a big deal about the difference between the modern concept of Satan and ego? Because you can't point your finger at ego and blame it for teaching you when you're the one who asked it to do it. And you also can't push responsibility for your choices and the consequences of your choices onto ego either. You chose. It's your responsibility. There are no outside forces making you choose anything, although you may have the outside forces of spirit guides, helpers, ancestors, and so on, providing some soft-spoken suggestions for how you might choose a different path. But ultimately, it's on you and your free will. You may not like how ego teaches. I certainly don't. So I try to choose spirit. Sometimes, though, I miss the opportunity because I'm distracted and not paying attention. But most choices are not irrevocable. We can change our mind. Even if we're caught in an ego-aligned lesson, we can still make spirit-aligned choices along the way. Alternatively, if we're suffering from the consequences of an ego-aligned lesson, well, once we've learned the lesson, we'll be given a new one. And at that point, we can choose spirit over ego as our teacher. There's one last point I'd like to make before closing. Ego is where we get our sense of human identity. That's invaluable, especially since we're here in this body, in this time, and in this place to learn from the experiences in our body. Ego teaches us how to function in this reality. So, although I've mainly discussed the pain that's often involved in ego's teaching methods, I think it's important to recognize, acknowledge, and even thank ego for the lessons learned, whether they were painful or not. Through ego, we learned how to socially interact with others, to take an interest in our appearance and cleanliness, to have goals and ambitions, as well as so many other things that make us who we are. It's not all about pain and suffering. Sometimes ego is simply teaching us how to be human. When I began looking more closely at my life, I recognized how often I chose ego to help me grow and evolve. Its lessons, although painful, were invaluable, and I wouldn't change a thing because of how much they changed me. They were exactly what I needed for me to get where I am today. Were there easier paths I could have taken through spirit? Well, undoubtedly, yes. I can recall several crossroads where I chose the more difficult path through ego. But that's the thing. I chose that. And I was going to learn the lessons either way. It's just that ego's path was the more painful one. If you're wondering whose voice you're hearing, there are a few questions you can ask yourself to help clarify that. Is the voice subtle and suggestive, or is it loud and demanding? Does the voice generate love or fear? Does the voice build you up or tear you down? Does the voice unify or does it divide? If you're honest with yourself, the answers are going to reveal who's talking to you. Then it's your choice whether you want to learn through an ego-aligned method or through a spirit-aligned method. Regardless of the teacher, you're going to learn, and that's why we're here. I've created a list of ego's attributes, and if you're watching on YouTube, I've posted them below this video. This is not an all-inclusive list. I have no doubt many of you could come up with more attributes of ego that you've dealt with in your own life. So please feel free to add more in the comment section below. I'm Jamie Perez with the Light Journal. Thanks for listening. If you're enjoying my content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you can be notified when new videos come out on this channel. Blessings on your journey, everyone.